Thank you for listening to Mormon Sex Info. This episode is an archived episode and is only now becoming publicly available. Mormon Sex Info relies on contributions. To contribute, please visit mormonsex.info. And now, please enjoy this episode.
Hello and welcome to Mormon Sex Info. This is Natasha Helper Parker, and I have Douglas Braun-Harvey back with me today for part 2 of our series of covering the 6 principles of sexual health. So excited to have you back, Doug. Thanks for being on this morning.
Glad to be back again.
And we are going to talk about exploitation, which is just such a super positive, fun-sounding word. So, yeah, we're gonna.
It does have that liability. Let's be frank.
Right. So, the principle being, of course, that we be non-exploitative in our sexual dealings with other people. So, yes, I'd like to start kind of again with definitions and how we set up the term. And probably with the concept that I think a lot of people, when they hear this term, immediately go with their brains to places like sex trafficking, abuse, things of that nature, which we definitely want to cover. But I think this term is much wider and expansive than that, and that we find ways that this actually seeps into lots of day-to-day things that I think most of us probably wouldn't self-define as exploitative, but we can be manipulative, or we can, kind of throw tantrums or dealing with our own discomforts, right? We can obviously come up with ways that we can be not the healthiest of partners for our people. So we're going to cover a big gamut here.
I think we are. And I think, one of the things I hear you kind of alluding to, Natasha, that I talk about a lot when I teach about this sexual health principle to professionals or, other audiences, is that exploitation is such a normal and typical human behavior, and that we don't teach people to be literate and observant and, able to see exploitive behavior when it happens. So when exploitation is finally seen, it tends to be seen in the most egregious, the most painful, in the most nefarious ways, because its other dimensions tend to be not really very visible in most, everyday situations.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. And I think there are a lot of complexities because it goes to the heart of, what I call the me versus we, like there's my needs and my desires and my wants, and I have a right to all of those things. And so do you, if I'm in partnership with you. And so it's the constant negotiation of those things that I think it gets tricky where we can fall into some of these tactics without, like you're saying, maybe even realizing that we're doing it. We don't want to be deemed abusers or manipulators or exploiters. And those words carry a lot of heavy baggage. And so it's hard, I think, to own, kind of like we see with, the terms today being used around racism or bigotry or things like that. It's like, oh, I'm not a racist, I'm not a bigot, but we all have these tendencies that are there and that are part of our culture and our biases that we may not even be completely aware of. So it is hard to want to self-define with some of these things when they sound kind of awful.
One of the things you said at sort of the beginning of this, of what you were just speaking, Natasha, was what I see as this I agree with you, common dilemma of this negotiation between the me and we. So the way I kind of like to think about when exploitation is present in a relationship, and I'm not talking about the most egregious antisocial forms of it, is that oftentimes this negotiation of the me versus we, I have needs, I have things I need, and then I know you have things you need, and then we have things, we have a relationship. There's also needs of the couple, of this relationship, and those create tensions. Those are oftentimes competing or conflicting needs, or not necessarily always compatible. Sometimes people solve this dilemma through exploitive behavior. It's a solution to a dilemma. So in other words, I can leverage my power and control over you to get what I need. That'll be the solution, because what I need, what I want, is actually what is more important here. And I'm willing to leverage my power and my control over another person in order to get that. And sex is one of the ways oftentimes these conflicts get resolved, that around sexual needs and sexual feelings or sexual desires or turn-ons, because negotiating these differences is something people have very little skills in being taught how to do, or even knowing how to do, that exploitation becomes a kind of human behavior that's relied upon at a very high level, a high frequency, when this lack of any alternative for having direct discussion or open communication about very painful and difficult issues, when that's the alternative, exploitation doesn't look so bad.
And I think that's a very strengths-based approach to understanding human behavior, because it's not that I think most people wake up in the morning going, "Ooh, I can't wait to use my exploitative behaviors on another person." But
a few antisocial people do.
There might be a few people who do, but hopefully most of us don't.
Yeah, and that's true. But I also want to normalize that component of the spectrum. There are people, when we're talking about exploitation, who do live in that end of the bell curve.
Sure.
Very, very small percentage. I feel compelled to include them in the discussion when they tend to be maybe not included, just like we're trying to include all these other people who exploit when all we want to talk about is the antisocial people.
Right. No, I agree. I thank you for that. So my point is that if that's not our intent, we usually understand, and I know you're trained in systems as well as I am, that even what can be deemed as negative behavior usually has a purpose, and that's what I hear you saying.
Yes, that's right.
It serves a purpose, and that's why we do it, not necessarily because we're just, quote unquote, bad people, which that's hard to define anyway, but regardless, it's just this idea that all behavior is usually purposeful in some way or form, even if it's unhealthy or not the most ideal way to go about things. So why don't we start with kind of your basic explanation or definition of exploitation and how you go about helping people understand even what this is?
Well, first of all, what I do, and I think we had to deal with it just initially here when we opened the discussion, before I get into definitions of exploitation with people, before I get into particularly having a person look at their own potential for engaging in this behavior, which is really difficult for people to do, I like to just soften the entrance of this word into a relationship by kind of announcing something smelly is coming into the room. So I say, we're going to talk about something right now. And the word is not nice to say. It's not a word we enjoy saying. It's not an easy word to sort of form sentences with. It's not a word we hear very much people really just say directly, forthrightly, matter-of-factly, and without judgment. It's just something that happens. And so it's hard to say the word in a non-judgmental way, but we're going to try to do that in our work together. I try to take the bite out of and then by that time they're looking at me like, what word is this? I mean, they're just like, they can't imagine what we're going to do. And so by that point, they're curious rather than reactive. If I insert the word exploitive too quickly and I just say it nonchalantly because I can, or I feel comfortable with it, or I know what I'm saying, it's a misattunement. And I'm thinking clinically here with clients, but it's still a misattunement even like with children or with other teens or with other family members. If you don't, really first understand and empathically understand that this word is not an easy word to put into conversation. It's just not. And so then I say, we're going to talk about exploitation and how one of the 6 principles of sexual health is non-exploitation. And then I just wait. And usually somebody has an assumption of what that word means, or somebody has an association with that word, or people have memories and thought. I mean, I don't have to even give the definition yet. People will be activated with memories and stories and vivid descriptions. I like to make space for that before we even get into the definition. So I'm just going to project, but I'm imagining if somebody is listening to this podcast, they might be having a memory right now of a time when they were exploited, or they exploited somebody else, or they witnessed exploitative behavior. If you were to go to today's Los Angeles Times, in the editorial page, there's a story about how ExxonMobil, one of the largest companies in the world, and the largest energy provider in the world, they did scientific study after scientific study showing that climate change and global warming was actually directly attributable to the burning of fossil fuels into the atmosphere. Their science showed that. for decades. Their marketing and public relations campaign completely sowed doubt into that science, even though they were conducting studies that absolutely conclusively proved that. Now, their position of power and authority as a major company, as an authority in this industry, and the wealth they had to create a particular messaging out there, that's an example of exploitation. There was competing needs. They needed the good science for their own company, but the good science worked against their profits. These are conflicts. These are huge existential conflicts for people. And oftentimes the way we resolve these conflicts, unfortunately, even in large issues such as a major Fortune 500 company in the planet and two human beings sitting in a marriage in their living room, will resolve these conflicts through an exploitive solution. And that means they have a position of power and they will compromise the other person's position of power by deceiving them, withholding information, whatever means necessary. And the thing about exploitation is they have to be ruthlessly willing to do this. Now, who wants to think of their spouse or a partner as somebody who's ruthlessly willing to do this? But, when people are scared and when people are conflicted and when people maybe have seen other people do this or they know they can get away with it, all sorts of things, it is a solution people will choose.
Thank you for all of that. That sets it up very nicely. Can we start the conversation maybe with some of the more typical seedy types of ways we talk about exploitation? For example, the sex trafficking argument. Is that something
Right.
you're okay talking about?
Yes. So the most agreed. Let's go to the ones that people are familiar with around sexuality. The most common forms of exploitive sex is illegal enslavement of another human being, forcing them to engage in paid sex activity. They're basically a slave. That is one of the most egregious forms of exploitation with sexual behavior there is. If we talk about sexual abuse or incest or sex with minors by adults, exploitation is the method in which they gain access to youth. They need to create an exploitive dynamic in order to have access to a youth for sex, unless they force them into it through rape. Exploitation, like if you tell anybody, I'll kill your mother. If you tell anybody about this, I'll leave your mother, and they know that they'll be homeless without this person, or nobody will believe you, or again, they use their position of power. This element of exploitation is an absolute essential component when a person is engaged in exploiting people for sex trafficking and for access to a minor to have sex. That behavior just doesn't happen without exploitation.
I feel like on the one hand, it's nice to see a lot of focus going into sex trafficking these days and a lot of concern and issues of that regard. But I see what in my mind is a confusion of the terms sex trafficking, sex workers, prostitution, etc. So, I think a lot of people think of sex trafficking as that first definition you gave where somebody's maybe kidnapped or enslaved or snatched off the streets. And I see a lot of even parents around my neighborhoods and my schools concerned about, these types of potential issues versus the much more complex issues, which, runaway teens or poverty issues that the culture is exploitative in some regards, and therefore people are willing, even as minors, again, these are complicated terms, because a 16-year-old that might be willing may not really understand what she or he is getting himself into and then can be exploited by the industry or things like that. But I think that there's a need for a little bit of a more complex conversation around sex trafficking and not just assuming that it never has any type of level of consent from the sex worker or that all sex workers are somewhat in exploitative situations.
Yeah, I think perhaps maybe one thing is the application of the name sex trafficking prematurely without knowing the circumstances. So sex trafficking is an actual crime and a real observable behavior, but it's also a name that's been used to kind of generally describe youth or minors who might be engaged in a variety of forms of paid sex or sex, transactional sex, trade for drugs or housing or a job. Or unfortunately, sex trafficking has moved into the general language so that we're not really only speaking of sex trafficking under the circumstances of real and actual sex trafficking. So we have to really be careful about that. The first thing I'd say is let's make sure people are actually talking about this actual thing called sex trafficking versus people who get paid to do sex under all sorts of circumstances. So I like to move the conversation to what's happening paid for sex rather than a conclusion of the power dynamics through language. And the conclusion of the power dynamics might be many of the words you used. Sort of assume exploitation might be present when all that we know is definitely present is the exchange of money for sex. We know that's present. That is real. Then we have to really dig down with each individual person, each individual situation, and find out what motivated that transaction to receive and to give money for sex. So I like to go to paid sex or money for sex as the next level. And let's just call the behavior what it is. And then we have to evaluate how exploitive it was.
Yes, I like that because I think with the moral overlay, obviously, it's difficult for many people to see any sex that's paid for as non-exploitative. And I think that's an important piece to put into the equation, that is actually a possibility. And also the moral overlay that I think when we think about exploitation, and I'm glad you brought up the Exxon example, people tend to think of sexuality versus many other ways that we are exploiting, whether it's through things like how much we pay our workers or how much we are honest about our research, all kinds of things that are don't have anything to do with sexuality.
Yeah, so let's just make it human behavior. Let's take the awful judgment like this is done by a very few percentage of people, and the rest of us human beings are free and clear from this kind of behavior. It's actually behavior we've all done.
So moving on then from the most egregious types of ways this happens, especially in the realm of sexuality, where would you want to go next? Do you want to go to...
I think the next realm of exploitation, and this is the most common form of exploitation I find in the world of sexuality and in the world of marriage and in the world of relationships. And that's when a couple makes an agreement about what the boundaries are of their sexual relationship. Now, the most common agreement for marital couples in the United States is that we will be monogamous and we will only have sex with each other. It is by far the most common sexual agreement of all agreements in couples and marriages across the country. It just is. But what happens is when somebody is unsure about wanting to keep that agreement, or maybe wanting to change that agreement, or maybe never intended to keep it in the first place, the way that they function is they pretend that they are keeping that agreement. And they have the power and the ability to convince the person that they're in the relationship with to believe them. Or the partner also doesn't want to see how the partner is actually not keeping the agreement. And the couple colludes together to not want to see the potential evidence that actually an exploitive dynamic exists in the couple. And so they silently, and without even possibly being aware of it, agree to not want to see this behavior.
I'm assuming the main part that you're talking about here is some form of infidelity, or either whether it's stepping outside of your marriage or even possibly less toxic types of ways. For example, masturbating without your knowledge, or I'm looking at erotic images without your knowledge. Things that may or may not be assumed in that relationship, but for some couples, those would be considered betrayals, and no conversations are happening around those things. And so one person is acting in a way, behaviorally speaking, that has not been contracted, and either that's kept secret or it's a collusion, like neither person wants to really address it, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Is that
Right. And it either happens around partnered sex with another person or solo sex. That's kind of the range of what we're talking about here, right? Either the exploitive behavior is done around some agreement around whether the person masturbates or not, or how they masturbate, or how often they masturbate, or what images they use while they're masturbating, or whatever it may be. And there's an agreement that these things, just certain dimensions of that behavior shouldn't happen, or they've agreed it won't happen, or it's sinful to happen, or whatever it may be. And the person does it and exploits their partner's belief that they're not doing it. There's all sorts of reactions and emotional reactivity when it's discovered that let's say a husband in this case, the images appear on their computer screen that they were downloading images of a female partner on an image being tied up with leather. And the partner is just shocked, not only that they're looking at this images, but they would actually find that image erotically arousing and of sexual interest. The wave of disgust they feel and the wave of shame they feel and feeling duped that they feel. And it all floods them. And that's what the discovery of exploitation is like.
So, how do I complicate this conversation to include exploitation, I'm guessing, on both sides of this equation, right? So, in other words, there's obviously the person who's acting in ways that has not been contracted, and that's a form of exploitation. And at the same time, I also find that partners who are very rigid and have, in other words, they're using their position of power as a marital partner. In other words, if you behave in any way, shape, or form that I'm not comfortable with, then this marriage is over, for example. I'm thinking of some of my clients that are in sexless marriages, right? So there's one partner who is saying, I'm not interested in having sex. I believe masturbation and pornography viewing is sinful. So therefore, even though I'm not going to have sex with you, I also don't want you to have a solo sex life. And so if you want to stay married to me, the expectation is you should just be, kind of asexual in your behavior. So right. Can we talk a little bit about exploitation on both sides of this equation?
I'm going to propose that it's even not sides. This is just another form of exploitation and another conflict that's being solved through exploitive means. So what I hear is there's a position of power by one person in this relationship that knows that severing this marriage is of such aversion. So, just absolute would never, ever want this marriage to be severed. And if somebody knows that and is willing to use that leverage of the threat of severing the marriage, they have enormous power. If one person is willing to walk away and the other one is just terrified at the thought of that or dreads it or would be so shamed by it or would hate the fact of not being able to be raising their children or lose faith in good standing in their religious community or who knows what it all might be. That's a great position of power that one of the partners has if they're willing to threaten all of that and be willing to use that weapon if they don't behave accordingly. This is not an unfamiliar source of power that somebody else in a relationship might be willing to use. And what in my therapy with my clients, I call it the severing response. When families and intergenerationally or within their own backgrounds, if they've seen families have this sort of history of the severing response, meaning that, families are capable of absolutely cutting off all relationships with a family member. When that's part of the intergenerational history, that threat has enormous influence in a marriage. So, for example, I had a man I was working with who, in his childhood, he sees his father interact or not interact with another person, just walks by an older guy, and the father leans over to his family member and says, "You see that guy that just walked by?" And he said, "Yeah." He said, "That's your grandfather." And they acted as if they absolutely did not know each other. Zippo. Now, what does that say to the child who's growing up in a family like this? It means families will do this to each other. They will. And if you know a family will do that to each other, and then you marry somebody, my gosh, a spouse will do it too. And so some people, when they have that in their history, that part of their family history that was so difficult and painful and maybe really hurtful and traumatic is an enormously powerful weapon that a spouse can use to gain power.
Yeah, and this even gets more complex as I think about how do we help people understand the difference between exploitative behavior versus correct boundary making. So, in other words, if we're having a discussion between two partners, there are definitely partnerships that calmly and respectfully get to a point where they're like, I honor your desires and your needs and maybe your sexual tastes, and they're really truly just not compatible with mine. And so now we have to maybe consider, a separation or a breach of our initial contract, right? And versus, I guess not a breach, a renegotiation of our initial contract. In other words, we may no longer stay married, or we may no longer, this is just not going to work for me. and
Right.
not seeing that as exploitative, like, well, I didn't get what I wanted, therefore I'm out.
Right. So what you just did, Natasha, was a beautiful example of how the 6 principles of sexual health work together. These principles don't work in isolation. They work in relationship to each other. So what you just modeled in that discussion was one of the other sexual health principles, which is honesty. That one of the ways out of the exploitive solution is to come to terms with sexual health also means honesty. And moving towards an honest and real and vulnerable discussion. So when we get to that sexual health principle, we'll see how these other principles are part of the whole choreography of maintaining sexual health. If non-exploitation is possible, if somebody's also committed to the sexual health principle of honesty and the next sexual health principle we're going to talk about after that, which is shared values. So the conversation you just described between a couple, they'd also have to have shared values, like it's important to respect each other. We value being known. We want to be known. That's a more important value than being right. Those are values, deep existential values that sometimes couples have to kind of figure out where they really stand on these things.
Yeah, and I think some of the most heart-wrenching sessions I'm a part of with people is when, even though I agree that there's a shared value of honesty and shared values, and in other words, they're really having a heart-to-heart talk, and one person says to the other, look, I love you and I love being partnered with you, but the idea of never having sex again is just not going to work out for me. I'm 45 years old and I've got, another 30 years, and I never want you to feel like I'm pressuring you or like you have to have sex with me, but this isn't going to work. And usually that other partner looks over at me and says, I get it and I totally understand it, but then it intrinsically just creates this pressure because I don't want the marriage to end. And so now I'm in a position where it feels exploitative, even though I can totally get that this partner of mine isn't, that's not their intent and that's not how they're framing it.
So now that situation brings another sexual health principle into the conversation that was not in the dialogue of what you just described a couple speaking of. So if I was sitting with a couple having that dialogue, I would do with you if the couple wanted to do with you, I might say something like, oh, now we're at a really important sexual health principle, and that's about sexual pleasure. That people have different values and different needs for sexual pleasure in their lives. And this couple seems to have a significant difference about the role and the needs and the desires for sexual pleasure in their life. And what does the couple do when one person desires sexual pleasure very differently than the other? And when does that reach a boundary of incompatibility?
Yeah. And that's the essence of the work that we do.
But I guess I point out, Natasha, that when you were describing that, notice how the couple, and this will happen often when people get into this territory, the sexual health principle of pleasure doesn't enter the conversation unless they've been educated about the 6 principles. I find when couples or when people have these 6 principles and they enter into these dialogues, they can become aware of which sexual health principle is being talked about right now. And it helps orient the conversation. It helps takes the emotional zing and pain so much out of the conversation. It gives a bit of a perspective in the conversation, and it makes it less personal. Oh, we're talking about a principle of pleasure here. You relate to sexual pleasure in one way. The other person relates to sexual pleasure in another way. How do we address this? Let's have an honest conversation about it. How did you decide that you're willing to live the rest of your life without sexual pleasure? How did you come to this conclusion? Maybe the spouse has never talked with their husband about that. How did sexual pleasure become something they were willing to live without the rest of their lives? That's an interesting decision, isn't it?
For sure.
And usually that decision is never discussed, how they came to it, and why they think that's the best solution.
Right. Well, you're doing an excellent job of role modeling exactly what you're so much a proponent of, right? Which is incorporating these 6 principles in all of the work that we as sex therapists do, but also as couples and individuals negotiate their sexual lives with themselves and others, that they can start learning how to think through their decisions and their ideas through these 6 principles. So That's really wonderful. I think that what I'd like to go into next then is, and then I think we've been interweaving this all along, but what would you say are some of the most common ways that you've seen where exploitation shows up between couples? So maybe things that people wouldn't necessarily have thought of as exploitative that we would kind of put into this category.
Right. I think the most common one of all is affairs. We have lots of words: betrayal, affair, stepped outside the marriage, is an asshole, a jerk, a narcissistic creep, a sociopath, disgusting. I mean, the gamut. I mean, the language just goes on and on and on. I think that's the number one. Now, once we get out of the marital issue and we get into how family life can be exploitive, I think the number one way family life is exploitive is when non-consensual sex has happened to somebody in the home. That means this family system is living under the tyranny of exploitation, whether they know it or not. Somebody has used exploitation on a child, either a family member, a neighbor, somebody who has access to that child in their church. That family system, without having any knowledge of it, is operating under the influence of exploitation. Because somebody's been involved in non-consensual behavior, and the way that happened was through, horribly cruel and vicious and ruthless forms of exploitation by a perpetrator. And the family's living in it, and they don't even know it until the abuse gets discovered. And then all of a sudden, all of these behaviors of the child, the way things happened, all of the ways in which a person interacted and related to people has to be completely now reinterpreted through the lens of they did that because they were under the influence of the power of an exploiter. And the family was too.
Which has what effects? So when there's exploitation within the system, what's the consequence of that?
Well, I mean, it's very stressful. So kids don't behave well. They lie. They have to make up stories. They have to view their parents as dangerous people who could harm them if this got exposed, that they could be shamed horribly. The world looks kind of dangerous if honesty were to happen, that they may know quite clearly that if they were to talk about it, that their parent would blame them. They may know that, and they're smart. They're not going to say it. They're not going to set themselves up for that. Imagine having to navigate all that, and you're 11. And then maybe it's a church member, and you watch your parents have these lovely interactions with a church member. They maybe invite them into their home. You're encouraged to get close to that person, and then your parents are angry at you. Why are you so not nice to that person? And of course, none of this can get said, so the child has to make something up. And this is a family system under the influence of exploitation and the tyranny of exploitation, because somebody has been ruthlessly willing to place people in these situations. And we call that child abuse.
And outside of the child abuse realm and outside of the basic affair kind of narrative that a lot of people get into, what are maybe some more common ways, more day-to-day ways that you see exploitation happen between, especially couples?
Let me move into adolescent sexuality, because I think this is the primary world of adolescent sexuality now. Because of social media, because of smartphones and the access to images and pictures in every single place human beings move on the planet. There's no place anymore, hardly at all, where a human being can't be photographed, like what they're doing. And so teenagers know this, and you try developing as a sexual person as a teenager, and all the mistakes you make, and all the foolhardy things you do, and all the curiosity you get engaged in, and all the stuff teenagers have been doing for thousands of years. But now it can be documented and sent around the world in 5 seconds. And that image lives forever. So the exploitation of public shaming, the threat of public shaming, the threat of humiliation is a dynamic adolescents are navigating every morning they wake up, trying to figure out who they are sexually, because that risk is out there for them. And I don't think, we've never had an adolescent generation before who's ever had to figure out how to do this. I mean, we have given them something to figure out that is a huge task. And that's the issue. It's used as a form of extortion many times to control adolescents' behavior amongst each other, their peer group or adults or, And then when these things are exposed, the brutality, the viciousness that's directed towards adolescents who make poor decisions around the access to all these images, we really, really punish the teen for making the poor decision. What's been difficult is we rarely punish the exploiter.
Right. This is stressful just thinking about it. I know there's lots of parents out there very stressed out about these issues.
They
And
are. They are. But notice how we don't use the word exploitation in these discussions.
yeah, no,
I'm,
I
I'm,
agree.
I'm stressed about the exploitive world my adolescent lives in. I need to help them understand that that is exploitation. They are illiterate around exploitation. And by the time they're 13 or 14 and they're illiterate around exploitation as a human behavior, it sets them up to be exploited. We should be teaching kids that a human behavior called exploitation, we should be teaching kids to know and see this by the time they're 8 to 10 years old.
Can you give an example of how you would start a conversation with a teen around exploitation literacy?
I would ask them, first of all, what they think the word means. And then I might say why I think I want to help you understand what that looks like. And then let's talk about ways you've been exploited already in life. Nobody gets to be 13 without being exploited. It's just not going to happen. It's not like, get ready, it's not going to start happening. It's been happening their whole life.
Right. And so what types of examples might you give? Or because again, if they're not literate,
Yeah.
how are they going to
Okay.
come up with examples?
Okay. So I can give this example from my own life. I'll give my own example. All right. I had an older, my sister knows this. We've talked all about it. I'm not telling stories out of school. My older sister, we had 5 kids in my family. I was the youngest of 5. And in certain situations of distress, when my sister wanted me to do something for her, and she knew I'd probably say no, she'd say, Doug, would you do this for me? And I protest. I was 8 years younger than her. And she'd say, well, Doug, if you don't do it, I'm going to tell Mom and Dad, you know what? And I'd look at her and say, there's no such thing as you know what. And she says, well, don't do it and we'll see. And that was enough for me. I was 5. Or I was 7, and I just did what she wanted. Because I was too terrified to find out what what was. Now, that's a perfect technique to exploit somebody because children project all sorts of things of what they don't want adults to know about them. So, a child goes through imagining all the horrible things they've done and that your sister knows, and she's ruthless enough, she'll tell my parents and put me through the horror of that. This is sibling relationships.
Right. Right. Yeah, I think parents do it too, right? Parenting tactics, the classic guilt trips and those kinds of.
Well, the exploitative part of a parenting issue might be, if you tell your father this happened, I'll never forgive you.
Yeah, encouraging secrets, right?
Yeah. Well, people can have privacy and secrets. The exploitive part is the threat that accompanies it. I really want this to be between you and me. That's a request. That's a negotiated boundary. That's human relationships. But if there has to be a threat to accompany it, if you don't abide by this boundary, I will hurt you emotionally or physically. Then you're using exploitation.
And how is that different from punishment for parents?
Well, a natural consequence might be, if you don't do this, then here's the consequence. Is a natural consequence for telling dad something mom doesn't want you to tell her that the rest of your life your mother won't forgive you? How is that a kind of just a reasonable consequence?
Right, yeah. Yeah, and I, going back even to your severing response, it made me think about even role modeling that the church system I come from, role models excommunication. So if you're not behaving in a certain way that we deem unacceptable, then you're kind of severed from the community.
That's right. So in different religious communities or in different cultures, the severing response is a normative, justifiable, completely supported decision in response to certain behaviors.
Which again, when some behaviors, correct boundary making may include a severing. And yet, I think what you're talking about is when that's done in a way that's undermined by really a fear or a manipulation to get one's needs met. So, for example, if my spouse is a convicted child molester, I may sever that relationship, protect my children, or regardless of the love I have or the respect I have or the honor I have for a person who made a severe mistake. And yet, that's very different, I think, than holding threats over somebody because we have different, maybe erotic tastes, or the church excommunicates people, for example, for being gay, or having gay behaviors, or so that's a very different type of, we want it our way, and if you don't comply with us, then you're out, versus you've done something that maybe legitimately we need to create boundaries around your behavior.
Right. Right. Now, one of the things I think that I sort of talk with therapists and other people about is culturally in our country. Again, I've traveled to other countries, so I can really speak to this as being something that is not universal around the planet, but it's fairly predominant here. And that's the acceptability of a sexual transgression being sufficient to sever a family. It's kind of a justifiable and acceptable solution to the harm and hurt of a sexual betrayal between two adults is to sever the family unit. That's reasonable. And in other cultures, that's seen as less reasonable.
Yeah, and I see the same kind of trend with movies. This is how I explain it. It's like it's okay to go see a movie where 500 people are killed off and there's financial disasters and people are, kind of ridiculously awful to each other in all kinds of, ways. But there's a boob showing, so no, you're not allowed to go to that movie, And so we do tend to, I think, in the American culture, and definitely in the, I think, conservative religious American culture, put more emphasis on sexuality than other things that we maybe have also concerns about, like violence and financial type of embezzling, cheating, stealing, all these other quote unquote sins, right?
Yeah,
of people.
I really like how you bring this up. I think if we use some of the financial exploitation that's gone on in the last 20 years in our country with banking industry and things like that, or the stock market exploitation that went on, when those couples were looked at, let's say a husband was involved in serious crimes with the stock market, in the late 90s, we didn't think, and it wasn't the primary narrative, well, that wife better leave him after what he did. If he was involved in similar transgressions around affairs or having sex with other women or men, and it wasn't in the relationship contract, one of the lead responses to that behavior would be, she better leave him.
Right. Yeah.
So what is that about? Are certain kinds of egregious criminal exploitation horrible, and that yes, that they should be punished and all that, and it's against the law, but there's a less of a standard of ending the marriage based on those behaviors. But when a sexual violation occurs, it's a much more acceptable standard to absolutely, that family ends, that marriage ends. And when people don't end the marriage, oftentimes there's a suspicious stigma that the couple has to endure.
Yeah, especially the person who was not involved in the behavior, like somehow that person is weak or fragile or stupid or...
Yep, those are all the stigmas. There they are. That's the stigma that person has to live with.
Yeah.
Kind of quietly, unspoken, assumed.
Right. Well, I know we're nearing the end of our time, so I do definitely want to get to some examples between couples, and maybe we can start even with some dating ones. I think that there's a lot of negotiations happening around sexuality from a pretty early age. The classic one being that I remember hearing, my parents warned me about, it's like, well, don't make the decision to have sex with somebody just because they're threatening to break up with you if you don't, type of boyfriend, girlfriend dynamic. So what types of examples would you say are pretty common either in the dating world, or do you see any differences, for example, in gay couples, heterosexual couples, etc.?
Some of the issues that are really difficult, and this gets to one of the sexual health principles, is protection from STIs, unintended or unwanted pregnancy, HIV. Oftentimes, there's difficulty being honest and non-exploitative about those issues. If somebody is living with herpes, do they tell or not tell their partner? When do they tell their partner? If somebody's in a dating situation and the assumption is that I'm only having sex with you, but they're really not, that can have ramifications for contraception. Is somebody actually saying they're using contraception and they're not? There was a recent example of somebody having sex with partners using a condom, but prior to using the condoms, he would put a little pinhole in the tip of his condom so that a part of his semen would escape into his sex partner's body while they were having sex. But the partner assumed, that they were using condoms and the fluid was protected from coming into their body. The list goes on and on and on. But I think how one protects each other in a sexual relationship around sexually transmitted infections, HIV, and pregnancy, these are big areas of exploitation, that people resolve these dilemmas around an exploitive solution rather than a more honest and straightforward discussion. I think it's a very common way. People don't even talk about contraception. Or they'll say, look, I'll pull out, that'll be fine, as if pulling out is a great contraceptive method. It's the worst contraceptive method there is. There's no other worse contraceptive method. So it's almost like saying, all right, let's use the worst contraceptive method to prevent a pregnancy here. Now, if they said that, okay, well, all right, maybe they just decided you both use the worst contraceptive method, but that's not what they're saying. They're presenting pulling out like it's like a great strategy. These are just random thoughts I'm having in response to what you said.
And what about in married couples? What types of negotiations would you say are pretty typical that would fall under an exploitive category? Outside of affairs.
I think erotic differences. I like this. Will you do this for me sexually? Don't do that for me sexually. Maybe pretending they like something sexually and they don't, and then it has to come out later that they don't like it. Or being willing to engage in something sexually and changing their mind about it and being afraid to say that. The world of the erotic and navigating honest and clear discussions about what an erotic desire is. Do I like oral sex or not? Do I like receiving oral sex or not? These are really common marital issues that are difficult to be honest about, really difficult to be honest about. And so couples may resort to threats. They may resort to, I'll tell people that you're into that. If threats of disclosure, erotic interest can be very shaming and stigmatizing if they're to be exposed. And so somebody might say, look, we're not going to do that anymore. And if you ever ask me to do that again, I'm going to tell people that you're into this. Things like that. Shaming, the threat of shame.
Right.
Is another
again,
strategy.
It just can go both ways. It can be like, if you don't do this for me, then this is going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
If you do this or want to do this, then this is going to happen. And again, that's a very different process that's based in, like you're saying, shame or fear or tactics of getting your way versus having a negotiated conversation that includes all those sexual principles where, yes, those things do have to be negotiated. There may be something you're not interested in doing with a partner. There may be boundaries that you need to create together. There may be sadness around the fact that your partner doesn't like or likes something you don't like. But those don't have to equate to exploitative measures to solve those problems, I think is what you're saying.
That's right. That's why this sexual health principle is so important. Consent, the one we just spoke of previously, and non-exploitation. These are the fundamental ideas of sexual health. All the other sexual health principles are built upon these two. If honesty is going to have value, if pleasure is going to be meaningful, if protection from HIV and STIs is going to be able to happen, there has to be a fundamental idea that I don't want to resort to the dilemmas of negotiating and handling all these difficult, vulnerable moments through non-consent and exploitation. If that's my solution to these dilemmas, then the rest of the sexual health principles aren't going to be met.
Right.
And often it's after many, many violations of these exploitive behaviors that somebody walks into a therapist's office for couples therapy.
Right.
And they don't even know that they've been under the influence of exploitation. They don't even have this language. That part of why they're so distressed is this sexual health principle has been violated over and over and over again. And this is what it feels like when that sexual health principle has been violated.
Well, and I find often, too, that it's almost like a cyclical pattern that ends up happening. It's like we sometimes respond with exploitative measures to exploitative measures. And so if I don't feel safe or able to present myself as a whole being, then it's more likely that I'm going to maybe be secretive or have an affair or things of that nature. Again, not to blame one partner or the other. I'm just saying these things tend to be systemic in nature.
And I think the systemic nature, because we're all in this soup. We don't live in a culture where we've seen it modeled, how somebody sits with another person in a non-judgmental, clear way and saying, what appears to me is you're being exploitive. And I'd like to figure out how we're going to address this without having to resort to exploitation. It's just too important to me to not have that be part of how you and I relate to each other. If you're clear on the principle, somebody understands this as a principle that's essential to them as a human being. I own this principle. This is who I want to be. That's why these are principles. Each human being has to decide where they stand on them. And even if the system wants you to become exploitive, we all have to deal with our own principles within a larger system.
Any closing thoughts then on exploitation?
I think one of the things that you brought up several times is these brings up a lot of emotion. It's difficult. It's a side of humanity that we don't like talking about. And we certainly don't like talking about the fact that exploitation and exploitive behaviors occur between people who love each other. But it does. And that doesn't mean they can't coexist. They do. You can still love somebody. But you have to figure out how you want to stop exploiting as a way to solve problems.
I think that's a great place to end. Thank you again so much for your time today, Doug. Really appreciate you being on.
Thank you, Natasha. Your questions and your thoughtful kind of bringing it to the day-to-day real activities of people was really helpful for me and sort of grounding this in just day-to-day life.
Good. I'm glad to hear that.
We took the long road home, turned minutes into miles. And as the evening traveled on, the sunset bathed your smile. We stopped beneath the desert stars, wrapped in each other's arms. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary
a trail with tears, pain and sorrow too.
But through every storm we traveled on, like lovers do. And if sometimes we fell apart, we always came back home. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth. Some people say love is blind and forever is too long. But I see your eyes in every sunrise. Can't imagine life alone. Let's take the long road on together until we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into the beyond. It's as simple as our love is. That's how I wanna go, all wrapped up in the arms of our extraordinary, it's nothing ordinary love. Ordinary, no It's extraordinary.